Before I read the printed messages in your bulletin, I want to ask you guys a question. Just raise your hand where you're sitting. How many of you have ever eaten pawpaw fruit? Oh my goodness, a lot more people than I realized. Okay, how many of you know where a grove of pawpaw trees is right now? One person other than me. Okay, well, good. That's more like I thought the pawpaw fruit. I'm going to read the text, and then I'm going to discuss it with you. The wisdom of the pawpaw trees. Doesn't sound very religious, does it? People that worship the Bible would probably not like this message. I worship Jesus of Nazareth, so I try not to worship the Bible. And Jesus derived wisdom from flowers, wheat, sheep, and all of creation. There's a certain wisdom in all living things, including a little-known tree that grows from New York to Ontario, Canada, from southeast Nebraska to eastern Texas and northern Florida. Living in the shade, often on north-facing slopes, it is a small tree and grows together in groves. Its long oval leaves catch secondary sunshine. Its small green-brown, mild-tasting fruit is a bit like mango or banana. Its leaves can cause skin irritation. I remember I took the leaf of some pawpaw trees at our family ranch, and it smells like it might cause skin irritation. It smells interesting. Few know about pawpaw trees, but what amazing lessons pawpaw trees teach. They resemble so many people living in anonymity, not valuable in the eyes of the world, mild, unexciting people, yet just like the trees, holding the soil, preventing erosion under taller oaks and elms. Pawpaw trees and people like this have a special niche in the world, so similar to you and to me. They produce needed oxygen and a little-known fruit. They belong in the world just like each of us do. Nothing outstanding, yet very real. We are like pawpaw trees. Jesus taught us that everything and everyone is important. Jesus talked about trees. He talked about lowly trees, and he talked about the tallest trees, the cedars in Lebanon. So this message is to encourage you to grow where you're planted. Everyone belongs in God's love. Whenever I see wildflowers, I remember Jesus' words, consider the lilies of the field, consider the wild flowers of the field. And every time I see wildflowers, I think most of the wildflowers that grow in this world, and especially in northeast Kansas where we are, most of those wildflowers are never seen by a human being. They grow isolated and alone. And many of our lives are like these wildflowers, or really like pawpaw trees. Jesus is very much in touch with all of creation. And so when he considered us, it's Jesus' fault that I'm bringing this message, because he said, consider the lilies of the field. Well, he also spoke about trees. And so virtually everything in the world that's created, with Jesus' direction, there's wisdom in that. There's knowledge in that. I had owned our family ranch for about 5 years, and I noticed there was this unusual tree growing down in the valley underneath the tall oak trees. And so I sort of kept my eyes on it, and then I was down there just at the right time of year in the summertime, and I saw that it had these little small fruit on it. And so I picked them when they were green. I didn't let them rot, and they didn't taste too good. But then a few years later, I picked them when they were ripe, and they had a real mild taste, a little bit like a mango that I ate in Hawaii, a little bit like a banana, but it was very, very mild. And then I was just up in southeast Nebraska by the Missouri River, and I was waiting for Kathleen, and all of a sudden I realized I was waiting in a grove of pawpaw trees. And some other tourists came by and basically asked me, what are you looking at? I said, these are pawpaw trees. And they'd lived in the Midwest all their lives. They had never seen a pawpaw tree before. Their leaves are about this long, about this wide, and many times they grow in the shade underneath other trees. Sometimes if they get out in the open when they're mature, they will produce more fruit. But as a general rule, they're secondary growth in a forest. And we talked about pawpaw trees, and then I was thinking how they're so much like you and me. We're basically anonymous to the rest of the world, you and I. And many people make fun of us for living in Kansas. And many more people make fun of us for living in a small town or in the country. Boy, in the old days, there used to be almost wars between kids that lived in the cities and kids that lived in rural areas, and fortunately that's eased up quite a bit. But you and I are not seen as very valuable in the eyes of the world. We're seen sort of as unexciting and mild. I'll never forget the time a black pastor from a great big church in New Jersey came to Kansas, and we're having a national convention in Kansas of our denomination. And I said, could you speak at my church? And so he's from this huge African-American church in New Jersey, and then a church about our size he spoke in. And after the service, he said something that really caught my attention. He said, the men and women in your congregation, they're the people that keep this country moving. He could tell just from looking at us that we were hard workers, that we had jobs that weren't too exciting. But if it wasn't for people like you and me taking care of the roads, raising crops, doing transportation in trucks, working in factories, there wouldn't be any United States of America. And I thought that was an incredible insight that black pastor had from New Jersey about people in Kansas. And so that's the insight that I want to share with you. And I think it's Jesus' insight. He talked about the little pepper trees. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand about pepper trees, but I grew up in a warm enough climate that pepper trees lived. And I remember thinking, that's interesting. That's where we get those little granules of pepper off these trees. And I noticed they weren't very big trees. They're fairly small. Jesus talked about them. But he also talked about these magnificent cedars of Lebanon, great, big, huge cedars that grow in the mountains of Lebanon. And Jesus was aware of creation. And basically Jesus said that little pepper tree was valuable. If you read that passage in the Gospels where Jesus talked about, he said that this little tree is small and yet it grows up, even birds of the air can nest in it. And so you and I are holding the soil of the world. We're producing fruit, even though people don't understand it very much. We're like bringing oxygen to the world. We live in what's called the Bible Belt of the United States. Our cities, although there are some churches and some big churches in our cities, as a general rule, our cities are as pagan as any pagan city in the Roman Empire or the Greek-speaking world. And we're the spiritual foundation of this country and of this world. Most of us living in the Midwest, we don't realize that. One of the reasons I came to the Midwest, I was tired of living in a pagan society as a Christian. I did not feel comfortable when everything was, I don't know, these are not clinical words, loosey and goosey in society. Everything was on the board. There were no values. There was no structure. People didn't hang together in families. They didn't have a sense of community. Everybody was from someplace else. I never felt comfortable in that kind of environment. And so, essentially, you and I are pawpaw trees. We're not real flashy, but we're holding the world together. Our roots, our spiritual roots, are holding this country together. And we're holding Horton together and Northeast Kansas together. And we belong in the world just as much as anybody else. I don't care if they're Elon Musk that is a multimillionaire, or the guy that owns Amazon.com. We're just as valuable as any one of those people. And in some ways, we're more valuable because we're more real and more spiritual. And one of the real things I hope you get out of this message is grow where you are planted. You would not believe the number of people I've seen in the last 55 years that I've lived in eastern Kansas. Well, I'm going to go to Colorado. I don't like Kansas. Or I'm going to move to South Texas, where Denver freezes, or Florida. Or I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., or I'm going to go to Chicago, or I'm going to go to Seattle. I've seen dozens and dozens of times I've seen people do that from Kansas. But you know what I've also seen? I've seen dozens and dozens of people spend 2 or 3 years out in those places like that, and they're back here because many of you are the salt of the earth. You and I have values. You and I love and care for people. People are not just things to Christians. People are important. And so I want to tell you, if you're thinking about doing that and you're hearing these words about, oh, well, it's called a geographic cure. Geographic cures do not work. Wherever you go, there you are. There's an old saying about somebody moved into a small town from another place, and they said to an old-timer, they said, "Are people in this town friendly?" And the old-timer was a wise person. He was somebody like you and me, and he said, "Well, how were people in the place where you lived before? Because people in this town are going to be just like the people you lived before." In other words, if we're friendly, if we're loving, if we're forgiving, we're going to gravitate to those people. If we're angry and hostile, yell at neighbors, call the cops when neighbors' dogs bark. I got to tell you a family story. When I was a little kid, my great-grandma, the whole family was at her house, and we were having some kind of family dinner, and great-grandma began yelling and screaming and just causing a fuss. It was embarrassing. I was 2 years old. I remember this when I was 2 years old. And so Grandma Sadler passed away, and literally, about 10 years ago, I called my cousin in Wyoming and said, "Sumner, I remember Grandma Sadler when I was 2, And she was yelling and screaming and just creating an incredible fuss, and everybody in the family rushed over to her and was trying to calm her down. And do you remember Grandma Sadler? He's a year older than I am. He said, yeah, I remember Grandma. When the neighbors' chickens would get out, she'd always call the police. I said, oh, okay, what I experienced as a 2-year-old, that was Grandma Sadler. It was that kind of just raising Cain wherever she went, you know. And Sumner went on. He said, yeah, she was pretty hard on Grandpa Sadler. It was hard for him to live with her. And we all have people like that in our families, you know. But grow where you're planted. Forgive others where you're planted. Love others where you're planted. Everyone belongs in God's love. And I want to share something that's going to be in next week's bulletin. And then I'll close with this. The promised land is not in the Middle East. The promised land is not in the Middle East. The promised land is inside you with your faith in God. That's the promised land. We think of it as being Israel and the Middle East. No. The promised land is here. Peace, the Holy Spirit, love, forgiveness. This is the promised land. Amen.